Good afternoon, Brad. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. I understand you're recently back from vacation. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Well, that sounds good. So, thank you again for agreeing to do this interview with us. We're very excited up here in Quebec. Dr. Brad Johnson est professeur de psychologie à la faculté de leadership, d'éthique et de droit de l'Académie navale des États-Unis et professeur associé à l'École supérieure d'éducation de l'Université Johns Hopkins. Il est psychologue clinicien et auteur de plus de 100 articles de revues et chapitres de livres, dont plusieurs sur le thème du mentorat. Il a écrit 12 livres lui-même. Cette entrevue se déroulera en anglais. So, Brad, you are the co-author of a book that was published in 2019, Athena Rising: How and Why Men Should Mentor Women. Your book is both an overview of the most recent research about mentorship for women in the workplace and a manual for how men can mentor women effectively and deliberately in a way that helps women realize their potential. Before we get into the meat of the matter, I'd like to talk about the title of your book. Athena is one of the principal Greek goddesses. She's the daughter of Zeus. She's the goddess of war, of wisdom, of handicraft. What is it about Athena's powers or her role in myth that resonated for you and your co-author in terms of women's role in male-dominated workplaces?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad to be here with you, Jennifer. And so the title, it's really interesting. My co-author, David Smith, and I were both professors here at the U.S. Naval Academy. And both of us work with young women every single day who, after 4 short years here, are heading out to lead sailors and Marines in combat. And so, the women that we encounter and the women that we work with so embody the kind of the spirit of that Athena archetype in the Greek myth that, not only is she a wise statesman, but she's also a proven warrior and clearly capable of leadership. The reason that resonated with us is one of the problems when it comes to men not mentoring women is implicit bias and the way that men, I would say, don't see women. There's this research in social psychology called the women are wonderful effect, where if you ask men, what do you think of women? A lot of guys say, oh, women are great. I love women. Women are nice, they're kind, they're gentle, they're caring. But what you don't hear is they're also powerful, they're effective leaders, they're capable, they're competent. So what I'm not hearing about women, if that's going on, unconsciously and implicitly, maybe I'm not going to mentor her. I don't see her as a future leader. I don't see her as worth the investment. So a big part of our choosing that title was to get men to think very deliberately about how they view women, how they see them. Because I think if they don't see them as rising leaders, future Athenas, they're not perhaps going to invest in them the way a great mentor should.
What a fabulous approach, extremely proactive. So the premise of your book is that mentoring is an effective way to develop people personally and professionally. And then in male-dominated environments, men mentoring women makes organizations more gender equal, more inclusive, and ultimately more successful. But you also cite research that shows that men find a mentor more easily than women do, and that even when women do find a mentor, the mentoring experience tends to benefit women less than it does men. Okay, so I'd like to start there. Does this research mean that in some cases mentoring is actually reproducing the gender equalities that were already there in the workplace?
Yeah, such a good question. I think that a big part of the issue here is this phenomenon we call homophily. You find this in the research, meaning I tend to look for people, and again, this can be implicit and unconscious, but I look for people who look like me when I'm offering mentoring or sponsorship or just collegiality in relationships. Who do I choose for friends in the workplace? Well, they're often people who look just like me. And if I'm not aware of that, then I think it can reproduce the kind of inequity that you're talking about. Because what will happen? Well, men who are in the majority in many organizations and professions are going to be looking for other men to mentor and push forward and sponsor. And you certainly see that. So unless there is some very deliberate intent here, And that can be both organizational, it can be individual. I, as an individual male, can be very careful and actually do an audit, ask myself, who am I mentoring and sponsoring right now? Do they all look like me? And if that's the case, why is that? Why am I only attracting or seeking out junior men and not women? Or do women not feel comfortable for some reason approaching me? And why might that be? And then from an organizational perspective, I think smart organizations get very deliberate about this. They don't rely on just chemistry or informal relationships, to pair people in mentoring. They actually have some structure. So if one of my organizational objectives is to get more women promoted, get more women into senior leadership, get representation of women better in the company, I need to be very structured in making sure that women have developmental opportunities. So that may mean formal mentoring programs. It may mean encouraging senior men to deliberately sponsor at least one or two women. But I have to be very transparent about that and very clear. A good example of this is Ernst & Young. They now, recognizing they have a lot of work to do to get more women into senior leadership, they now require every man in an executive leadership position to publicly sponsor at least two women. And so now he's held accountable for the outcomes, right? If the women he's sponsoring are not progressing, then he's held accountable and people are going to ask why.
Interesting. Now, some programs, some organizations don't make mentorship or sponsorship mandatory because they want the person, the mentor, the sponsor, to want to do it. Right? How do you answer that?
Yeah, that's another great point. I mean, I don't want people in a mentoring perspective or role who either don't have the skills as a mentor or for whatever reason are very reluctant, because that can undermine a really good mentoring pair or a great mentoring match. So I think the organization in that case, honestly, Jennifer, has work to do in communicating very clearly why mentoring matters, why gender diversity matters, why it's important that not only are we recruiting more talented women, but also making sure that we're advancing them into senior leadership roles. If I'm not articulating that and then holding people accountable, then I think you get more reluctance. Men see this as an add-on obligation. It feels weird to mentor a woman. I don't know why I've been paired with her. No, we need to communicate this very clearly. This is part of who we are. It's part of our business objective, and you have a role to play here, especially as a senior male in the organization. We have expectations that you're going to contribute to this objective.
That's interesting. You're distributing responsibility between the organization and the individual, and it's interesting to me because it brings up the image of these races where your legs are tied together, and so you have to kind of hop along, right, and keep an egg on a spoon or something like that.
Yeah.
And the eggs and the legs can't get too far ahead of each other. They have to kind of more or less move in sync, right? One can't.
Right.
How uncomfortable should we accept being when we throw ourselves into something new? Because what you talked about is a little bit of cognitive shock, right? You said that as a man, you should not only be mentoring men. As a woman, I should be looking for individuals who are a little bit different from me, perhaps. Not always mentoring my mini me. But at the same time, we also sometimes tell dyads, look, it's once in a while you'll get paired with a mentor who just doesn't fit.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's true. And there are multiple reasons for that, right? I think that sometimes there's an issue of mentor competence. And I don't think, well, honestly, Jennifer, I'm sure your organization thinks about this a lot, but I think too many organizations don't. They just randomly pair people, right? So we assume that anybody over a certain level in the company must be a good mentor, right? Because they've been here long enough. And we find that that's not true. A lot of people don't have the emotional intelligence or the communication skill or the empathy to really show up as a great mentor. So I think we got to be more deliberate and honest about selecting people who have the capacity to do this well. And then how about also do the training? right? So let's equip them with really terrific mentoring skills. So I think that's something that we can do to mitigate that. But when a pairing just is not working, I think for other reasons, I think we need to acknowledge that and give people what I call a no-fault divorce, right? Or a no-fault ending. We're not blaming anybody. We just want to make sure, especially for that junior person, that he or she ends up with somebody who's a good fit.
Okay, so I'm just telling you right now, Brad, that here in Quebec, we have no fault collision. Okay. If I hit another car, then everybody's insurance pays for their own repairs.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
So maybe we can think about that in terms of mentorship.
About that no-fault collision.
All right. You said something in an interview a year or so ago that really intrigued me. We're talking about the reproduction of gender equality, and there's an assumption that I used to have that as younger people come up in the ranks, that there'll be kind of like a natural protection against that. What is your opinion?
I think that it's a mixed answer, Jennifer. I think that it is true that millennial and or other generations of younger employees coming into the workforce tend to have more egalitarian attitudes. I think that's really clear. They have expectations for equity that our parents did not have in the workplace. So you are finding that, and that's a hopeful thing. However, too much of it depends on the culture and the context, right? So a great illustration of this is Silicon Valley, largely populated by young men in the tech industry, right? And you would think that because they're young men, they're more egalitarian, they're more promoting of gender equity. The opposite is the case, because they go into these work environments where you have older men who perpetuate these deeply sexist behaviors and attitudes. And it actually is an awful place for a lot of women to work. So there's a book called Brotopia written about this culture. And so I think we can't assume that always if it's culture largely of younger men, that it's going to be better for women. It really depends on the role modeling they receive, and especially the role that more senior men play.
That's an excellent point. Well, we're developing AI pools of expertise here in Montreal, of a lot of tech companies, a lot of video game companies, a lot of artificial intelligence companies that are, desperate for labor, and some of them are putting in place mentorship programs. And yes, so we have to be careful not to assume this prophylactic kind of effect. If you had any advice about people who are designing mentorship programs in these kinds of environments, with this perspective, what would it be?
Yeah. Number one, I think that if I really wanted to push back on the effect that homophily has, for starters, let's not let people self-match or self-pair. I think that there can be some very thoughtful pairing process based on the objectives and the developmental needs of the mentee. That's wonderful. But let's really strive for some matching that gets to diversity and gets to these cross-cultural matches that can be really, really powerful. We find, interestingly, whether it's race or gender, once those relationships form, they're just as effective as same culture relationships. And so no reason we shouldn't be doing this, because there's so much to benefit when it comes to having a mentor or mentee who looks different from you and brings different experience to the workplace. So have a thoughtful pairing process, make sure that you're doing the mentor training, and a slice of that should, I think, include cultural awareness and cultural humility, and how to approach people who don't look like me with real curiosity and a learning orientation.
I appreciate you saying that. Canada has stepped up our immigration program of late. Now that is slowed because of COVID, but we were admitting hundreds of thousands of people every year from everywhere in the world, and our diversity is growing so fast. So yeah, absolutely. Let's put everybody to work at that. I'd like to talk about a phenomenon that you discussed a few years ago in an article with the Harvard Business Review. Okay, you referred to the WIMP penalty.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the WIMP penalty is a phenomenon where egalitarian men experience backlash when they advocate for gender equality. Their peers actually see these men as less competent, and not just their male peers. In some cases, both women and men see egalitarian men as less competent.
Yeah.
What are your experiences?
It's disheartening, isn't it? Right? That research. So here's my experience. When it comes to what I call the interpersonal part of allyship, which is just how do men show up in the workplace in relationships with women specifically, men who are great mentors for women, I find don't really get the WIMP pushback. I just don't see that as much. Where I see this is when men do what I call the public side of allyship, meaning they show up as public disruptors and public advocates. So when another man makes that really sexist comment in the meeting and the male ally says something about it, like, hey, knock it off, or that's not who we are here, we don't do that, he's more likely to get a bit of that pushback, like, what's your thing, man? Why are you so into this gender equity? He's going to get those kinds of questions. And I think he just needs to be ready for that. He needs to have a personal narrative. He needs to be ready to say, this is why it's not okay with me, and make I statements and talk about why it personally is offensive to him when women are demeaned. Mm-hmm. He needs to be ready to talk about women that he cares about and why this is a topic that is close to home and close to the heart for him. And he also just needs to make this part of his brand, meaning he's got to be consistent everywhere he goes. And by the way, he needs to advocate for both men and women. And I think if people see that it's just part of his leadership brand to be egalitarian, to be promoting both men and women, people of different races, I find that those men get a lot less pushback, especially if they're pretty confident in delivering that personal narrative.
Isn't that interesting? I just finished reading a book by Audre Lorde, Sister Outsider. Yeah, written in this essays, a collection of essays in the 60s, 70s, and 80s about her experience as a Black lesbian artist in New York City and other places, and the kind of racism that she came up against. And one of the things she said was that she realized at a certain point in time that she had to stop, she had to just start having the same narrative for everybody as soon as she entered the room. She had to put out there that she was either Black or lesbian or a woman or whatever it was that was most likely to offend the people in the room. She needed to get it out there as quickly as possible.
Interesting.
Yeah, because then she wouldn't spend energy defending it.
Yeah. Right. And, I think one more piece of that, Jennifer, is if I'm a guy who has a strong network of colleagues, other men who share my views, other male allies, having that community of male allies, I think really strengthens my position.
It's interesting because what you're talking about is a little bit what they teach children in schools to counter bullying.
Yeah, right.
They teach them to stand together against bullying.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it makes all the difference. When I'm in that meeting and a guy makes a really sexist comment and I say something, it really makes a difference when another gentleman in the room says, yeah, I agree, that was really inappropriate. Mm-hmm. There's some strength in multiple voices, and it can be other women too, but I think we've got to reinforce and amplify that message.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I read an article lately by two researchers, Stephanie Johnson and David Heckman, okay? And they were talking about how men are not the only ones to be penalized in this way, not the WIMP penalty, but another kind of penalty. So their research showed that women and minorities who promote diversity often receive the same kind of condemnation or down-putting. For example, women or members of a visible minority who hired other women or other members of a minority were judged less efficient and less competent than people who hired a white male. And this was even true if the people who were ranking them were also women or a visible minority. Okay, so you're a psychologist. I don't want to put you on the spot. is there a way to explain why members of a disempowered group penalize people who are trying to help members of a disempowered group?
Yeah. That's such an interesting thing. And I'm not a social psychologist, but what comes to mind for me is this process that we see where people who advocate for folks who look like them, and they're often very disempowered groups, so if I'm one of the few women in a company and I loudly sponsor a junior woman, lots of interesting research showing that I get labeled as showing favoritism, right? That the reason I'm sponsoring her is I'm just trying to show favoritism to other women. She may not be very competent. The only reason I'm sponsoring her is she's a woman. And not true when I, as a majority, I'm a white male, when I sponsor a junior woman, nobody says that about me. So I get the opportunity to be viewed as a gender champion, and my female colleague who does the same out loud sponsorship gets labeled as showing favoritism in a very kind of unfair double standard. And I wish I could offer, what is that process called in terms of bias? And I don't have a good word for it, but we simply find that in the research literature.
And that's very interesting. And do you think it could be just our automatic unconscious discounting of what women say or what disempowered groups say? Like whatever they say, if they say the same thing, research has shown this, they can say the same thing, but it's just worth less.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, that's largely why, in the research on meeting dynamics, we find that women get interrupted 3 times more than men, and women don't get credit for their terrific, brilliant ideas. Often men get credited. When a woman is part of a team and, she makes a really significant contribution to that team's success, largely she doesn't get credited for it, but the team gets credit. Not true when it's a guy. When a guy makes a major contribution in a team setting, he's more likely to get the credit for that as an individual. So yeah, it is a bias. It afflicts all of us, not only majority members, but minority group members as well.
But what does it mean for mentoring, Brad? So yeah. Right?
Yeah, well,
pair women with women because they're going to, both of them are going to get penalized, perhaps. I don't know.
I guess here's my thought about it. And this often surprises people when we share this data. When a woman has a male mentor, on average, she makes more money and gets more promotions. And it's not because men are better mentors at all, simply because men in many organizations and professions have more rank and power and social capital they can use on her behalf. So I think that I don't want to just pair women with women because it's not probably going to be as advantageous depending on the organization. I'd love to broaden her network. And so would it be good for her to have some women as mentors and advocates? Yes. It would also be good for her to have a couple of men in her network. And so I'd love to broaden it out and help her build a constellation if I could.
Yeah. And these are the best networks, right? The ones that are diverse for gender, for age, for profession.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I listened to a webinar that you gave last March. You said one of the most important things mentors can do is to counter imposter syndrome. Okay, so imposter syndrome is especially common among women when they are in the minority. Your suggestion to mentors was to affirm their female mentees, to share their own imposter syndrome stories, because we all get imposter syndrome sometimes, and to avoid contributing to women's imposter syndrome by taking credit for the mentees' achievements. Are those still your best practices?
I would add to that. And it's interesting you asked this. I'm glad you did, Jennifer, because, as somebody who's been writing in this area and speaking for a long time, I still am learning things all the time. And so if there's one thing about that article I could take back if I could, I probably wouldn't use the term imposter syndrome because other people have written about this, I think, very powerfully and said that when you call it a syndrome, you inherently pathologize it, right? It almost becomes a diagnosis. And we know that women have imposter experiences, I might use that term, or imposter feelings more often than men, because they often get messages that they don't belong, right? Or that, you're a unicorn. It's kind of weird that we have a woman in our tech department. You're a one of one. So of course, she starts to feel a bit like an imposter because of the messaging, even if that's just implicit. So I would probably stay away from the term syndrome. And I would probably, certainly do all of those things we recommended: the affirmation, the normalizing, the sharing my own experiences. I might add to that, helping her in any way that I can understand how the culture is making her feel like an imposter. And I think if she can see that, it might help her not feel so unique, or feel like she is, somehow inadequate or incompetent. So I'd love to counter that with focusing on how the culture is making her feel like an imposter. And then I would certainly like to use a lot of humor. I think imposters can end up feeling pretty perfectionistic. So, if that's straying into zero-sum thinking or zero error mentality where I can never make a mistake, I'd love to counter that with some humor and normalizing. And then, I'm going to go out of my way to make sure that she knows she belongs here and she was not hired by mistake.
I support those extra, those additional best practices 100%. It's interesting. Mentorat Quebec has implanted a lot of programs in STEM fields lately. So engineering, tech, like I mentioned, and our education of people who are engineers and people in tech fields is somehow missing, because these women don't understand. They're extremely well educated, very, very smart people, but they don't understand the systemic nature of the obstacles that face them. They personalize those obstacles. And what you're talking about when you say, we're not going to call it a syndrome, this is not particular to an individual, this is particular to a culture, it's particular to the environment that they live in. If you live in an environment that is not inclusive, that tells you you don't belong, you feel like you don't belong, you feel like you're an imposter.
Yes. Yeah. And a corollary to this in the social psych research is really interesting, Jennifer, the stereotype threat research, so interesting studies where, you get that super talented mathematical person who happens to be a woman that you're referring to. And right before she has to perform on some mathematical test, you say, you realize you're a woman and women don't do as well in math. You communicate one of the stereotypes. We find that her performance actually does go down. And so this is one of those areas where, as a mentor, I can say, look, people are going to be telling you all the time that you're a woman and reminding you of your gender status as a way to undermine your performance, even if they're not doing it deliberately. Let's just remember, let's go over the data, that there is no correlation between gender and brilliance in mathematics. I just want to remind you about that every day when I see you.
Yeah. And for those of our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with stereotype threat, it's the idea that when you're confronted with a stereotype about you or about a group that you're part of, you conform to the stereotype, even though you know it's not true. So if I, as a woman, walk into an environment where people expect women to say silly things, it's more likely that I will say something silly, even though in my normal life, I don't usually say silly things.
Right. Yeah. Good example.
Yeah. I'd like to ask you about a phenomenon that we don't see much in Quebec, but seems to be more popular in the United States, the phenomenon of male ally groups. Can you please tell us what these groups are, what they accomplish, how they work?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, Jennifer. And I've actually been really thrilled to see this. And here's where we're seeing male ally groups. Most organizations nowadays have some sort of women's network or affinity group or an ERG, an employee resource group. And I see this, for example, in a lot of tech companies. I see it in financial organizations. My colleague and I just finished a conversation with women at Qualcomm, a tech company, so they have They have Q women. It's their affinity group for women in the company. And the problem with that is if it's only women getting together day after day or month after month to talk about gender equity and how they're going to overcome the negative pushback they get to achieving that, we have something like 200 years to go till we get to, for example, pay equity in the workplace, unless we get men involved. And so this is the beauty of these male ally groups, which are largely grassroots. So these women's ERGs will partner with some of the men in the company who really get it, right? These are the male allies who exhibit a genuine commitment to equity in their everyday behavior and their relationships. And they ask these men to come in, affiliate with the women's ERG, and sort of start growing this grassroots group of male allyship. And the male allies meet, they talk about showing up more effectively as advocates for gender equity. They talk about collaborating with the women's ERG. They start attending those events when they're invited by the women's group. And pretty soon, you've established this culture where you have a lot of collaboration between men and women, at least in the groups within these companies. And it's a nice way to indoctrinate other men, pull other men into maybe a male allies group or curriculum where they meet occasionally, they talk about their challenges, they talk about how to show up in the workplace. So I see that as a really wonderful thing. And I think smart organizations are promoting that more and more.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah, I can just imagine that if you had that kind of group and somebody were, for example, to bring up an example, let's say a man were to bring up an example of how he witnessed a woman being talked over, something like that, other men it might kind of educate them to keep their eyes open. It might make them realize that happens in their meetings too. And so there becomes kind of like a critical mass that forms about people who realize, hey, wait a second, we need to name this, we need to change this.
Yeah. And the other thing I love about this is it takes it off women's backs. It's not their job to educate men about gender inequities, that they've been dealing with for years. This is an opportunity for men to self-educate, and then in collaboration with women that they work with to start taking more responsibility and holding both themselves and other men accountable.
Right. Because there's the other aspect of this that you also mentioned, which was that you don't want allies to actually go making policy for the people who are, right?
Right. Yeah. The last thing we need is for a guy to show up at a women's diversity event or whatever and start speaking for women, right? Or telling women how to achieve gender equity. That has happened from time to time, that mansplaining kind of vibe, and it's just never appreciated and not effective.
Yeah. I've witnessed it. I've witnessed a panel about women's treatment in an organization. And after the introduction, there was a request for whoever might want to share an experience. And there was this little pause. And then a man spoke up. There was, I don't know, maybe 3 men in a group of 30 women. And a man spoke up and took the podium for 10, 15 minutes to talk about how he had been unjustly accused of harassment when he was young, which may or may not have been true. I have no idea, but it took over the space.
Yeah. We don't need men hijacking, so my co-author Dave Smith and I have some rules for men when they show up. So you get invited to a women's ERG event or an equity event, go, stay the whole time, be quiet, listen, take notes, learn, and then at the right time say, okay, this is really helpful. Now, what role can I play in collaborating with you? What would be most helpful? I am not going to make assumptions, and I'm certainly not going to start speaking for women in my company.
Mm-hmm. Those are very good practices. And what do we do, Brad, when the worst happens and we say something sexist or racist that we don't mean to?
Yeah, happens constantly to all of us, right? We step in it. Our intentions are good, but we miss something. We get it wrong. And, I think there are a couple of things that I can do. Number one, I can be ready for that before it happens by having what I would think of as a kind of a cadre of gender confidants. And for me, these would mostly be women who trust me, who know that I'm trying to be better and get it right, who would give me the feedback when I did that. These are the women who would come to me and say, hey, Brad, today in that meeting, when you said that, you thought it was funny, but a lot of women cringed when you did. Let me tell you why. And that's why it's not okay. And then when I get that, the way I react to her has got to be in the right spirit. So I need to be ready for that feedback because it often comes at a time when I'm not expecting it. And I don't want to be defensive. So I need to be ready to say thank you. I am really going to think about that. Would it be okay if I came back after I did some processing and talk more and try and learn more about how I can be better? I really appreciate you letting me know that, and I apologize. I am not going to gaslight her and say things like, hey, you're blowing it out of proportion, or I think you didn't hear me right. No, men do that too often, and it just lacks humility, and it's just not effective.
Well, this is very interesting because as best practice, we often tell our mentees, you have to be willing to take a risk. You can have a safety net, but you got to try it. If you don't engage, you won't grow. And what you're saying is almost like advice to the mentor who's mentoring somebody in a minority, somebody in a disempowered group. You take a risk, mentor. You won't always get it right. Possibly you may say something that's racist, sexist, discriminatory in some way or another, but you're engaging.
Yes. Yes. I love the way you're framing that, Jennifer. And one of our favorite best practices is for men, maybe men who are mentoring, maybe men who are mentoring women or women of color. And I'm really interested in what it looks like for her to show up in the workplace fully as herself. But I don't know that. And I don't want to make assumptions. So I might say something like, would it be okay if I asked you about blank? That asking to ask practice, I really like that because then it's up to her in terms of whether she wants or feels comfortable sharing that. But I've let her know just by asking it that way that I am really curious and I'd like to be the best mentor that I could for her. But I'm also not going to be intrusive. I'm going to let her decide what to share.
That's a very useful comment. And I pay particular homage to that because as I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, Canada is a rapidly diversifying community. And a lot of newcomers get asked the same questions over and over. Where are you from? Where are you from? Where are you from? And the person who's asking it can think it's an innocent question, but for the person who's receiving it, sometimes it isn't because they don't want to be continually number one, reminded that they're not from here. It makes them feel outside. And also it's a bit of personal information that not everybody is asked. So the concept of asking respectfully permission, at some point, do you think we could talk about where you're from or something? I'd like to know, if ever you feel comfortable.
Yeah. Or even just what parts of your cultural experience feel most important to you or that you'd want me to understand as your mentor.
That's a great way to put it. We're getting close to the end of time. I would like to ask you about sponsorship. You and others have said that as wonderful as mentorship is, it's not enough. Men also need to sponsor women. What do you say about that today?
I say 100%. I would even double it. I think that it is so important. The research is really clear that even when women do have a mentor and that person has maybe got significant social capital, he or she still doesn't sponsor as much if it's a woman. And especially this is the case for men. So men, for different reasons, Jennifer, can feel reluctant to loudly sponsor women. And that's how I would frame it. If you want to be an excellent mentor for a woman, you can't be avoiding what I call loud sponsorship. And here's a litmus test kind of question. Are you talking about her when she's not even in the room? You should be. You should be telling key stakeholders in the organization how great she is and what she's accomplishing and singing her praises. If you're not doing that, it's a huge disservice. It's a missed opportunity. And it's one of the reasons we struggle so much to get more women promoted into significant leadership roles, because they get very tepid, sort of weak sponsoring. And I think that's something that I have to take more seriously. If I'm mentoring any traditionally disenfranchised, a marginalized group, I have to really work on the sponsorship.
And you don't see a difficulty, though they can be both functions in one person?
Yes, I don't see a problem with that, because I think inherently that happens anyway. And, in a terrific mentoring relationship, chances are really good I'm going to get to know you pretty well. And if you're this really talented person, I'm going to get a front row view to your talent and all the things you're achieving. Why wouldn't I want to tell other people about that and also serve as a sponsor? So I'm not a big fan of totally divorcing those roles. I do understand that somebody can be a sponsor without being a mentor, and that certainly does happen. But I hope that more mentors are willing to also do the advocacy and the sponsoring.
I agree with you. I would like to end our conversation, Brad, by going back to the beginning and indeed going back to the roots of the word mentor, right?
Yeah.
So, mentor, of course, was a figure in the Odyssey. He was the tutor, I guess, or the regent that Odysseus appointed when he left home.
Yeah.
And it turns out that Mentor actually wasn't that great a guy, right? So he let the suitors, Odysseus's rivals, harass Odysseus's wife, and they ruined the palace and they ate all the food and all this kind of thing. And then we have kind of Athena, right, who guides Odysseus, who gives him challenges, but also gives him weapons. And she does the same thing for Telemachus, who is Odysseus's son. She gives him honest feedback. She's kind of like the ideal mentor. Why is it that we don't think about those kind of functions also in Athena today? Why is it that the word mentor has stuck?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Myth can be very powerful, and we don't ever go back to the source like you've done and been very careful about that. But it's absolutely true. The original mentor, at least in the myth, was terrible at the job. He just didn't show up. And so Athena had to do a lot of this. And I think one of the things that illustrates for me is that in the best scenario, the best mentoring relationships, both the masculine and feminine are sort of embodied there. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. The kind of the things that we associate with the feminine, maybe more of the caring part of guidance, and the things we associate traditionally with the more masculine, the challenge, for example, all of those things are important. And so I think the construct of mentoring needs to take that into account. These are relationships first and foremost, and we need the masculine and the feminine intertwined in that task. And I will just say, I think that I'm still learning, certainly in this area of mentoring. And here's just one more illustration where we often don't pay attention to wording. So the word protege, actually a French origin, to protect. I use that word as in everybody else for years in my writing, mentor, protege. And then it was brought to my attention that the original, the verb to protect, that comes from in its original usage meant a protected woman, a woman who was cared for. And it had this very unpleasant kind of ownership and protective vibe that didn't really fit with mentoring in a healthy sort of way. So I and a lot of others have stopped using the protege word, and I choose mentee instead, because I think sometimes language matters, and I think we just need to honor that.
I agree with you. And I'm glad that we have that those roots so far back, so thousands of years ago, and they're still echoing today. And Athena and Odysseus made a fantastic pair.
Yeah.
Right? Their story is still alive today.
Yes.
And you have added to that story with your beautiful book, Athena Rising. So thank you so much, Brad, for your time and your wonderful expertise. It's a great benefit to everyone who's read you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thanks for including me. Great conversation.